Hello there, and welcome to Just About Earth, where curiosity curls up beside wonder and science whispers stories to those winding down for the night. Tonight's soft-spoken journey takes us somewhere unusual, into a version of our planet you wouldn't recognise even if you squinted. A place with no flowers, no fish, no familiar continents. A world wrapped in alien air where life itself was little more than a stubborn dream in the mud. 3 billion years ago, Earth wasn't just young, it was wild, simmering, shifting, strangely silent and chaotically alive all at once. It was a time before time as we know it. No mammals, no bird song, not even the quiet buzzing of an insect. Just ancient oceans and clouds of gas and something else. Something tiny, determined and quietly revolutionary. Life. Primitive, microscopic, clinging on through the harshest odds. But let me ask, where in the world are you listening from tonight? What year is it? Over there in your corner of the cosmos? And if this journey brings you peace or sparks your sleepy imagination, I'd be ever so grateful if you liked the video or subscribed. It helps this small stargazing corner of the internet reach others who might be wondering what Earth used to be before it became ours. So settle in, slow your thoughts, and let's begin. Because 3 billion years ago, in a world with no trees, no mammals, and no moonlight quite like ours, something astonishing was already unfolding. And to understand it, we'll have to rewind Earth's story far beyond pyramids and ice ages, deep into the haze of prehistory, into a time when the sun was dimmer, the days were shorter, and the oceans were thick with secrets. Let's go back. Not just back in time, but back to a different version of Earth. Sometimes stories begin not in ancient times, but in small, strange moments. Moments that seem out of place. Like a compass needle that wobbles where it shouldn't, spinning ever so slightly away from north. Or a cliff face in Australia streaked with bands of iron-red rock. Silent but defiant, as if it remembers something we've long forgotten. The modern world is full of such echoes. Subtle clues that something enormous happened a long, long time ago. Take, for instance, a patch of land in Western Australia, an expanse of stone called the Pilbara Craton. At first glance, it's not much to look at. Just dry rock and scattered brush under a fierce sun. But hidden within those layers of stone are tiny structures, microbial fossils so old they make the dinosaurs look like newcomers. Some of them are nearly 3.5 billion years old, which means they are among the oldest direct evidence of life we've ever found. Or travel to South Africa, where the Barberton Greenstone Belt unfolds like the pages of a battered book, each layer a different chapter in Earth's early past. There, geologists chip away at rocks that formed in a time when the Earth's crust was still learning how to behave. The minerals they uncover carry whispers of ancient seas, violent volcanism, and microscopic life that had just begun to breathe. These places don't shout, they hum, and the scientists who work among them, like geobiologists, geochemists and field researchers with sunburnt notebooks and a taste for mystery, are the translators. They read the language of isotopes, sediment patterns, molecular traces. They follow the tiniest clues to reconstruct a world we cannot visit and yet still walk upon. One of those scientists, William Schopf, stared into a microscope in the 1980s and saw filaments, faint, hair-like shapes embedded in rock that looked suspiciously like cyanobacteria. Not everyone believed him at first. Some said the shapes were just mineral oddities, nothing more. But over the years, as new techniques emerged, Raman spectroscopy, isotopic analysis and scanning electron microscopy, the evidence built up like sediment in a shallow sea. Those weren't just mineral quirks, they were once alive. And this is where our strange journey begins, not with thunder or cataclysm, but with the quiet realization that the Earth was alive, even then. Not in the way we see life today, with antlers and feathers and fruit, but with something smaller, something ancient, something that would one day shape the sky itself. But to understand what that means, we have to leave behind the world we know. We have to imagine Earth not as a planet of blue oceans and bustling cities, but as a landscape of extremes, alien, raw, and impossibly resilient. 3 billion years ago, the Earth spun faster. A day lasted closer to 14 hours than 24, and the moon hung heavy and closer in the sky, tugging at tides that surged more violently than they do today. The sun was dimmer, maybe 70% as bright, casting a fainter light across a planet wrapped in a thick, hazy atmosphere. There was no oxygen, at least not in the way we breathe it now. The air was a mix of nitrogen, carbon dioxide, methane and ammonia, more suited to a laboratory fume hood than a picnic in the park. There were no continents as we know them. Land was scattered, archipelagos of volcanic rock rising and falling with the restless movement of tectonic plates still in their infancy. Massive underwater volcanoes bubbled and hissed on the seafloor, belching heat and minerals into the dark ocean. These were the hydrothermal vents, black smokers, white smokers, each a crucible of chemistry, where hot mineral-rich water met cold sea in a violent chemical ballet. And it was there, many believe, that life may have truly taken root. Imagine it. No forests, no grass, just rust-coloured waves lapping against rocky shores. The sea, a rich, soupy brine of iron, sulphur and dissolved minerals. And somewhere in that ancient water, tiny organisms, archaea, bacteria, floating, dividing, slowly figuring out how to turn sunlight into energy. These were the ancestors of photosynthetic life, and their playground was the primordial ocean. One of the great oddities of this era is what scientists call banded iron formations, those red and grey layers found in ancient rock all over the world. For a long time they puzzled geologists. Why would the planet be littered with these iron-rich stripes, laid down in rhythmic patterns? The answer, it turns out, is linked to one of life's earliest revolutions. You see, early Earth was rich in dissolved iron. The oceans were saturated with it. Iron floating freely in the water like invisible ink. But then, certain bacteria learned a trick. They began to use sunlight. Not just passively, like plants basking in a window, but actively. They harnessed it, and in doing so, they released a new gas as waste: oxygen. Now, in today's air, oxygen is comfort, it's breath. But 3 billion years ago, it was dangerous. It was radical, literally. It reacted violently with the iron in the oceans, oxidizing it, rusting it, causing it to precipitate and settle on the ocean floor. Over millions of years, this process repeated. Oxygen was released, iron rusted, layers formed. Red for rusted iron, grey for intervals without it. And what we're left with is a geological record, a barcode of Earth's first biochemical rebellion. The bacteria behind it, likely cyanobacteria, tiny blue-green architects of the future atmosphere. They didn't know what they were doing, of course. They weren't planning a breathable sky. They were just trying to survive. But in the process, they began to terraform the planet. Not with machines or master plans, but with chemistry, with time. Back then, Earth didn't have an ozone layer. Ultraviolet light from the sun scorched the surface, which meant most life huddled in water, shallow pools, underwater mats, or tucked inside minerals for protection. These microbial mats, layered and slimy, clung to rocks in tidal flats, forming strange dome-like structures called stromatolites. And here's the wonderful part. Stromatolites still exist today. In places like Shark Bay, Australia, you can see them. Clusters of bubbly, rocky mounds poking out of the water like an ancient memory made solid. They're alive, and inside cyanobacteria still go about their work, unaware they're living fossils, survivors of a time so distant it barely feels real. But the rocks remember. It wasn't just oxygen that shaped this ancient world. Methane too played a role. Early Earth's climate depended on it. A potent greenhouse gas that trapped heat in the absence of a strong sun. Too little, and the world would freeze, too much and it would boil. And so, balance was everything. A dance of gases, tectonics, and biology. The atmosphere breathed in chemicals from volcanoes and breathed out new ones from microbial colonies. The oceans swirled with minerals that fed and were fed upon. Nothing was still. Even without trees or trilobites, Earth was alive in its own strange way, and through it all, the magnetic field pulsed in the background, a silent guardian generated by Earth's molten iron core. It shielded the planet from solar wind, preserving the fragile atmosphere and creating auroras no one was yet around to see. That same magnetic field is why our compasses work today, and why tiny particles in ancient rocks, magnetite crystals, point to where the poles once were. This is how geologists reconstruct the past, not just from fossils or gas bubbles, but from the way minerals align, from the isotopes they contain, from how layers stack and shift. It's like listening to a story told in a language older than language itself. So when a compass needle shudders slightly off true north in a pocket of ancient terrain, it may be whispering of a time when the world was younger, stranger, and bathed in a very different kind of light. We are not the first to alter this planet. We are just the first to write about it. And yet, even in those early aeons, the stage was already being set for everything that would come next. Oxygen was on the rise. Microbial life was quietly reshaping the chemistry of oceans and air. The tectonic plates, still unsure of their lines, were beginning to drift, split, and collide, creating early mountain ranges and hinting at the continental ballet to come. There was no event yet, no explosion, no mass extinction, just the slow burn of biology meeting geology, a long, silent prelude. But the curtain was about to rise, and the planet, as it so often does, was preparing for a transformation. To imagine Earth 3 billion years ago is to step into a dream stitched together from rock, chemistry, and silence. There were no maps, no continents named or known, no creatures with eyes to witness the shifting tides. The world did not yet have a face, only moods, stormy, molten, brooding, serene. A planet not made for us, yet already becoming us. Start at the edge of an ancient shoreline if you can find one. There are no beaches in the way we know them, no seagulls overhead, no shells scattered in the sand. The land, what little there is of it, rises in jagged tongues of black volcanic basalt, crusted with mineral salts and coated in microbial mats that shimmer just faintly in the slanted light of a sun still learning to shine. These shorelines are newborn, barely stabilized, rising from oceans that lap not with familiarity but with heat and sulfur. The water itself is not clear blue, but murky, mineral-rich, and perhaps tinged with reddish-brown like rust in suspension. It smells of iron, of life still hesitant, of chemistry rather than biology. Every wave carries whispers of volcanoes and hydrothermal vents, plumes of hot, metal-rich water billowing into the ocean's depths, feeding unseen microbes who treat sulfur and iron as nutrients, not poisons. These are alien waters on a planet not quite Earth yet, not in the way we think of it. The skies above would look strange too, hazy, orangish, perhaps even pink at times, filled with methane and ammonia and the thick breath of 1 billion volcanic sighs. There are clouds, certainly, but they hold no promise of gentle rain. The atmosphere wraps the planet like a thick protective fog, shielding it from ultraviolet radiation, but also sealing it in heat, like a greenhouse made of gas and lightning. And then there is the land, raw, cracked, fracturing along young tectonic seams. There are no trees to sway in the wind, no grasses to soften the edges of stone, only rock, ancient, pressure-baked and glistening with minerals that form only under the most extreme conditions. Greenstone belts twist through the land like scars from an ancient wound, now frozen in place. These regions, like the Pilbara in Australia or the Karpval Craton in South Africa, are some of the oldest surviving pieces of Earth's crust. Time capsules, geologic memory etched into the planet's skeleton. If you stood on this primeval Earth, you'd hear little. No birds, no insects, no mammals. The silence would be absolute, broken only by the deep, distant rumble of a volcano or the crack of stone under pressure. It was not a world built for comfort, but it was alive, and life, despite everything, had found a way. The earliest life forms were single-celled and microscopic. They left no bones behind, no footprints in the mud, but they changed the world in ways that bones never could. These ancient microbes clustered in mats, forming sticky biofilms that clung to rocks, hovered near hydrothermal vents, or floated just beneath the ocean's surface where the light was dim but sufficient. They absorbed chemicals, they released gases, they split molecules with patient, relentless precision, and over time their metabolic whispers became planetary roars. Some used sulfur in their metabolism, exhaling foul-smelling gases that would later shape the chemistry of the oceans. Others learned to feast on iron or hydrogen. But perhaps the most radical among them were the ones who figured out photosynthesis, not the modern kind with chloroplasts and leafy greens, but a crude, primitive version that still managed to release oxygen into the environment. These tiny architects didn't know they were dangerous. They didn't know they were rebels, but with every breath of sunlight, they were changing the atmosphere in ways that would eventually be catastrophic for almost everything that came before them, and still, they grew. In shallow seas, microbial mats thickened over time, layer by layer, slowly building stony structures known as stromatolites. Imagine a dome made not of concrete or clay, but of countless generations of bacteria, each layer living atop the last, like a microbial city stacked over millennia. These formations grew slowly, sometimes taking centuries to rise a few centimetres, and yet they were persistent. Some even fossilised, leaving behind domed shapes in ancient limestone beds, testaments to a life that refused to stay invisible. You can still visit living stromatolites today in a few rare places. Shark Bay in Western Australia is one such spot. There, the water is too salty for most modern predators, so the ancient structures survive, a living window into a world that predates trees, insects, and even complex cells. Back then, Earth's interior was hotter, more active. The mantle churned with fierce energy, and the crust was thinner, more prone to cracking. Tectonic plates were in their infancy, but they were already drifting, colliding, and giving rise to volcanic island chains. These proto-continents, small and scattered, bore little resemblance to the continents we know today. They were rugged, largely barren, and constantly reshaped by the chaos beneath. There were no ice caps. The poles were likely warm, the equator scalding. Rain may have fallen as acid, reacting with the minerals in the rocks and etching new chemical pathways into the planet's surface. Rivers, where they existed, carried dissolved iron instead of the clear fresh water we drink today. The chemical weathering of rock by this rain would, in time, play a critical role in regulating the Earth's temperature, drawing down carbon dioxide, balancing the planet's atmosphere in an endless feedback loop between land, air, and life. This feedback loop is known today as the carbon silicate cycle, a slow, silent thermostat for the planet. And even 3 billion years ago it was already ticking along. At the same time, the magnetic field, generated by the churning of Earth's liquid outer core, was hard at work. Though weaker than today, it was strong enough to deflect the worst of the solar wind, helping the atmosphere stay in place. It was a quiet hero, invisible but essential. Without it, the solar wind might have stripped the planet bare, leaving Earth more like Mars, dry, cold, and lifeless. In the oceans, chemical gradients formed around hydrothermal vents. Hot, mineral-rich water gushed from the seabed and met the cold ocean, creating zones of intense energy and complexity. Here, primitive microbes clustered, forming entire ecosystems based not on sunlight, but on chemosynthesis, a metabolic strategy that relies on chemical energy rather than light. Even today, life thrives in these dark places far from the sun, using ancient methods inherited from a time when the world was young and the sky was not yet blue. And speaking of blue skies, there weren't any. Not yet. The sky of early Earth, rich in methane and lacking oxygen, likely had a hazy quality, perhaps reminiscent of Titan, Saturn's orange moon. It wasn't until oxygen began to accumulate in the atmosphere that the sky cleared and the familiar blue hue emerged. This transformation, when it came, would be dramatic, but in this moment, 3 billion years ago, the sky was still brooding, the sea still rust-coloured, and life still working quietly beneath the surface. Temperature, too, was a strange dance. The young sun was fainter than it is today, a problem known as the faint young sun paradox. Logic would suggest the planet should have been frozen, locked in an eternal snowball, and yet geological evidence points to liquid water and warm climates. How? The answer lies, once again, in the greenhouse gases. Methane and carbon dioxide formed a thick atmospheric blanket, trapping heat and balancing the weak sunlight. Life, in turn, contributed to this balance, producing methane, altering chemistry, shaping the very air around it. The planet was a feedback machine, and life was already turning the dials. And yet, despite all this, Earth was fragile. A single shift in gas ratios, a sudden tectonic upheaval, or an influx of meteor impacts could have altered everything. Indeed, the late heavy bombardment may have only recently ended, an era when the inner planets were pummeled by asteroids with alarming regularity. Some scientists believe this barrage delivered essential elements like water and phosphorus. Others wonder how anything survived at all. But survive it did, in the quiet corners of shallow seas, in the cracks of ancient rock, in the chemical symphonies of vent systems. Life endured, it adapted, it changed the chemistry of its world, and it laid the groundwork for everything that would follow. In time, these microbial pioneers would flood the atmosphere with oxygen, a gas that to them was waste, but to future organisms would become lifeblood. This shift would not be gentle. It would cause die-offs, mass extinctions, and a complete reordering of Earth's ecosystems, but that's still to come. For now, Earth is on the edge of transformation. The air is heavy with potential, the oceans swirl with unseen innovations, and the land, raw and restless, prepares to host the greatest drama in planetary history. The slow emergence of complexity, of breath, of creatures that would one day wonder what this world once was. We are not just living on Earth, we are living inside its story. And this chapter, the one from 3 billion years ago, is not one of kings or wars or civilizations. It is one of chemistry, persistence, and invisible revolutions. The next time you hold a rock in your hand, consider this. It may be older than bones, older than leaves. It may have formed at a time when the sky was red and the sea was thick with iron, and life was just beginning to wonder what else it might become. The Earth was different then, but it was already dreaming of what it would be. It's a strange thing to imagine that something as gentle and life-giving as oxygen could one day be a planetary villain. But in the story of Earth, survival has never been about kindness. It has always been about chemistry. Roughly 2.4 to 2.1 billion years ago, several 100 million years after our last scene, the Earth experienced what scientists now call the Great Oxidation Event, or GOE for short. It sounds almost celebratory, doesn't it? As if the planet threw a party to welcome oxygen into the sky. But for most of life at the time, it was no celebration. It was an apocalypse. Let's retrace our steps. By this point in Earth's history, photosynthetic microbes, likely cyanobacteria, had been around for quite a while. They'd been quietly releasing oxygen as a byproduct of photosynthesis for hundreds of millions of years. But all the oxygen hadn't been building up in the atmosphere. It had been going somewhere else, into the oceans, specifically into iron. The ancient oceans were full of dissolved ferrous iron, and oxygen readily reacted with it. This process created insoluble ferric iron, which precipitated out and sank to the seafloor. This is how those mysterious banded iron formations came to be. Layer after layer of rust laid down in rhythm with the slow breath of microbial life. But iron is finite, and eventually the ocean's iron sponge became saturated. At that point, something changed. Suddenly oxygen had nowhere else to go. It began to accumulate. First in the oceans, then in the air, and when it did, the chemistry of the entire planet tilted. At first, the oxygen levels were still quite low, less than 1% of modern atmospheric levels, but it was enough to disrupt everything. Many of the microbes that had thrived in an oxygen-free world were anaerobic, meaning they didn't just ignore oxygen, they found it toxic. To them, this new molecule was not a blessing, but a poison. And now it was everywhere. Some scientists believe this was the first mass extinction in Earth's history, not a dramatic meteor strike or volcanic outburst, but a quiet chemical murder carried out over millions of years by the tiniest agents imaginable. The atmosphere changed colour, the ocean shifted chemistry, metabolic pathways that had once dominated the Earth were rendered obsolete, and for the organisms who couldn't adapt, extinction was their only inheritance. But oxygen, for all its destructive potential, also opened new doors. With oxygen in the environment, cells could begin to explore a new kind of metabolism, aerobic respiration. It was far more efficient than the anaerobic processes that came before. For every molecule of glucose, aerobic respiration yielded many times more energy than its anaerobic cousin. It was like upgrading from a hand-crank radio to a full solar panel array. The stage was being set for complexity. But it didn't happen all at once. Evolution is patient. It took hundreds of millions of years for life to really capitalize on oxygen. The first wave of oxygen may have caused chaos, but in its aftermath, Earth began to shift towards stability, at least temporarily. Still, oxygen was not the only player in this drama. As oxygen levels rose, methane levels likely dropped. Methane, that potent greenhouse gas, had helped keep the Earth warm under a faint sun. But oxygen reacts with methane, converting it into carbon dioxide and water. And while CO2 is also a greenhouse gas, it's not nearly as effective as methane in trapping heat. The result? A rapid decline in global temperatures. Some scientists believe this triggered one of Earth's first snowball Earth events, a time when glaciers extended all the way to the equator, and the planet may have been almost entirely encased in ice. It's a chilling irony. The rise of oxygen, the very molecule we now associate with warmth, fire, breath, may have frozen the world. The evidence for these global glaciations comes from glacial deposits found at tropical latitudes and from a curious signal in the isotopic record. Carbon isotopes show a dramatic shift during this time, suggesting widespread changes in the carbon cycle, possibly driven by a mass die-off or a sharp decline in photosynthesis. Imagine the Earth then, vast sheets of ice covering the oceans, reflecting sunlight back into space, volcanic islands poking through the white stillness, a frozen silence draped over a world still learning how to breathe. But Earth, as always, found a way out. Volcanism continued beneath the ice, releasing carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. With no liquid water to absorb it and no photosynthesizing life to sequester it, CO2 levels climbed. Over millions of years the planet warmed, the ice retreated, and the cycle resumed. This interplay, oxygen, methane, carbon dioxide, temperature, is the heartbeat of Earth's deep past. A slow, erratic rhythm. A climate system shaped not just by sun and orbit, but by microbes and minerals, and in the middle of it all was the invisible work of evolution. One of the most intriguing consequences of this oxygenation was the emergence of eukaryotic cells, organisms with complex internal structures, including nuclei and organelles. Unlike the simpler prokaryotic cells that came before them, eukaryotes were like tiny cities, compartmentalized, efficient, and capable of greater diversity. They may have originated through a process known as endosymbiosis, in which one cell engulfed another and the two began living together, not as predator and prey, but as partners. Over time, these internal guests, once free-living bacteria, became organelles like mitochondria and chloroplasts. This was not a single moment, but a slow unfolding, a series of improbable accidents that together gave rise to a new branch on the tree of life, one that would one day lead to algae, fungi, animals and humans. But the trigger, the spark that set this new trajectory in motion, was oxygen. It is one of Earth's great paradoxes. The very substance that killed off vast swaths of life also laid the groundwork for everything to come. It cleansed and cleared. It destroyed and delivered. It was not a single event, but a phase shift, a tipping of balance in a planetary experiment already billions of years underway. And the evidence for all of this? It's everywhere. In the rocks, yes. Those ancient iron bands, those glacial tillites found near the equator. But also in the chemistry of old sediments, in the sulfur isotopes that carry the fingerprint of rising oxygen, in the preserved biomarkers of once living cells. In Greenland, in South Africa, in Western Australia, researchers have trekked across some of the oldest terrains on Earth, sampling the past with hammers and core drills, analysing the residue of ancient oceans that dried up before land plants even existed. And what they find is a pattern, a transition, a turning point in Earth's story, marked not by destruction alone, but by transformation. The Great Oxidation Event didn't just reshape life, it reshaped the surface of the planet. Iron formations gave way to red beds, sedimentary rocks stained by iron oxides, formed in oxygen-rich conditions. The very colour of Earth's surface changed. What was once grey and black became rusted, oxidised, tinted with the breath of microbes long gone. It's no exaggeration to say that the world became red because of bacteria. And all of this, the oxygenation, the glaciation, the emergence of complex cells, was still just the prelude. Earth's deepest dramas were still ahead. But in this era, roughly 2.4 billion years ago, the rules changed. Oxygen was now a permanent fixture in the story, and life, for better or worse, would have to adapt. If the Great Oxidation Event marked a turning point in Earth's story, then what followed was something like a deep breath after a long silence, except the breath didn't come all at once, and the silence had only shifted. Earth had oxygen now, yes, but it didn't yet have stability. It didn't yet have balance. What it had was feedback, and feedback on a planetary scale is never a straightforward affair. The newly oxygenated atmosphere began to trigger a cascade of reactions, each subtle, each significant. Methane, the powerful greenhouse gas that had once kept Earth warm under a dim sun, was being broken down. It couldn't coexist peacefully with rising levels of oxygen. As methane levels dropped, Earth began to cool, and that cooling didn't happen in whispers. It arrived in ice. There is compelling evidence that soon after the initial rise of oxygen, the planet plunged into one of its earliest and most extreme climate events. A global glaciation so deep it may have frozen the oceans from pole to equator, a snowball Earth, though perhaps not perfectly smooth or completely uniform, more of a slush ball Earth, as some researchers suggest, with open patches of water near the equator, ringed by thick glaciers miles high. Imagine that for a moment. A planet once wrapped in warmth and methane haze, now sealed in frost. White oceans, still air. A sun shining weakly on a world encased in ice. Not for a winter, not for a decade, for millions of years. This wasn't a quick freeze and thaw, but a long pause, a planetary contraction. Some scientists estimate that the ice may have persisted for tens of millions of years, a near total standstill for photosynthetic life. The ocean's surface sealed away the sunlight, the shallows darkened, and life retreated again to the depths. Hydrothermal vents, subsurface brine pockets, anywhere warmth and nutrients could be found. And yet, Earth didn't stay frozen. Why? Because volcanoes never rest. Even beneath a frozen sky, the churning mantle continued to push heat and gas to the surface. Volcanoes, unconcerned with climate, belched carbon dioxide into the air. And with no forests or plankton to absorb it, that CO2 built up slowly, inexorably, like steam inside a sealed vessel. Eventually the greenhouse effect returned, not as a trickle but as a flood. Temperatures rose, glaciers cracked. The great white stillness began to melt, retreating across the face of the earth like a tide going out. And when the oceans reopened, when the skies cleared just a little, life surged forward again. Not the same life, not the same chemistry, but life nonetheless. We see the echoes of this transition in the isotopes left behind: carbon, sulfur, molybdenum and iron, all carrying subtle signatures that reveal changes in oxygen levels, ocean acidity and global temperature. These elemental whispers, locked in ancient sediments, act like instruments in an orchestra still echoing across billions of years. They tell a story not of chaos but of response, because the Earth is not static. It is not just a backdrop to life, it is a participant. And this feedback, between life and atmosphere, between rock and water, is what makes our planet so extraordinary. Other worlds may have volcanoes, some may even have oceans, but this dance, this give and take between biology and geology, is what makes Earth, Earth. Oxygen continued its slow rise after the first great wave, not as a steady climb, but as pulses, bursts, long plateaus followed by sudden increases. It would take over 1 billion years before oxygen reached even a small fraction of today's levels. And through all that time, life experimented. Cells diversified. Some clung to anaerobic habits, others learned to adapt. Some grew larger, more complex. Still others learned to collaborate. One of the great innovations of this era was symbiosis, not just between cells, but between life and environment. Consider the rise of eukaryotes, complex cells with internal architecture. Their emergence didn't just change biology, it changed what biology could do. These new cells had nuclei to store and protect DNA. They had mitochondria, once independent bacteria, that now churned out energy in exchange for shelter. They had flexibility, structure, and potential. And slowly, these new forms of life began to diversify. They branched into lineages that would, billions of years later, give rise to fungi, plants, and animals. But in this moment, this quiet period following planetary chaos, they were still microscopic, still floating in oceans where oxygen hovered like a storm on the horizon. And then, another mystery unfolds. Roughly 1.8 billion years ago, oxygen levels stabilized again, but not at modern levels. Instead, they plateaued. For hundreds of millions of years, they hovered at a fraction of today's concentration. This strange pause is sometimes referred to as the boring billion, an era in Earth's middle age where not much appeared to change. Evolution slowed, oxygen stagnated, the climate cooled and stabilized. Compared to the violent transformations that came before and after, this stretch of time seems calm, quiet, but boring? Not quite. Because beneath that surface stillness, the planet was refining its machinery. The slow erosion of rocks continued to deliver phosphorus and other nutrients into the oceans. The carbon cycle ticked along, genetic diversity simmered quietly, and in the shadows of microbial mats, multicellularity was beginning to stir, not just clusters of cells sticking together, but true cooperation, division of labour, specialisation, the first whispers of tissues, organs, structure. Life wasn't idle, it was preparing. Meanwhile, the geological record shows signs of tectonic shifts. Supercontinents began to form and break apart. Rodinia, one of Earth's earliest continental assemblies, rose and stretched across the globe, rearranging ocean currents, climate patterns and nutrient flows. Mountains formed and were ground down, rivers cut through rock and carried elements to the sea. Feedback, again, on a grand scale. And all the while oxygen waited in the wings. It had not disappeared, it had simply paused, held in check perhaps by the limits of nutrient supply, or by the delicate balance between production and consumption. Every breath of photosynthesis was met with a reaction somewhere else, a balance sheet of planetary chemistry. But balances don't last forever. Eventually, near the close of the Proterozoic eon, roughly 800 to 600 million years ago, something shifted again. Oxygen levels began to climb once more, slowly at first, then more dramatically. This second wave of oxygenation, sometimes called the Neoproterozoic oxygenation event, would pave the way for the rise of animals. The exact trigger remains debated. It may have been tectonics, delivering more nutrients to the oceans. It may have been a change in microbial metabolism. Or perhaps it was simply time, the slow accumulation of genetic, geological and chemical readiness reaching a tipping point. Whatever the cause, the result was unmistakable. The Earth became, once again, a world in flux. And with oxygen now rising for the second time in planetary history, the stage was set for the Ediacaran biota, a strange and beautiful menagerie of soft-bodied organisms unlike anything alive today. Their fossils, found in Namibia, Newfoundland and Australia, reveal quilted fronds, disc-like forms, and enigmatic spirals pressed into ancient seabeds. These were not yet animals as we know them. They had no hard parts, no obvious heads or mouths, but they were multicellular, they were large, and they were the first visible signs of life organising itself into complexity. None of it would have been possible without oxygen. But as before, oxygen was not alone. The planet's carbon cycle, now humming more powerfully, began to amplify climate swings. Another snowball Earth, perhaps more than one, gripped the globe, possibly triggered by the rise in oxygen itself. Ice returned, life retreated, and once again feedback danced its strange duet. And yet, again, Earth recovered, and this time it emerged changed. Not only was the world more breathable, it was more dynamic. Complex life had taken hold. Ecosystems, food webs, symbioses, all were beginning to weave together. Cells no longer floated alone. They built bodies, tissues, colonies. They sensed light. They moved. The Cambrian explosion, when it arrived, would bring eyes, shells, limbs, predators. But the foundation had been laid long before, in the deep, slow, oxygenated churn of Earth's middle years. Looking back now, it's almost mythic. The rise of a molecule that shaped the sky, froze the oceans, killed the old and seeded the new. A gas that acts both as breath and blade. A substance so ordinary to us now that we forget its past was anything but peaceful. And that's the nature of planetary change. It doesn't always roar. Sometimes it creeps. Sometimes it poisons. Sometimes it transforms. Oxygen did not ask to be a hero or a villain. It simply was. And life, tenacious, adaptive, forever curious, simply found a way to live with it, or die trying. When Earth changes, it doesn't do so politely. It tips, it tumbles, it ricochets between states like a pendulum hung from a moving ceiling. And when oxygen entered the room, the entire planetary system began to wobble. The Great Oxidation Event was not a single moment, not a neat vertical line on a timeline labelled before and after. It was messy, protracted. A long, slow transformation that unfolded over hundreds of millions of years, sometimes stalling, sometimes surging but never turning back. And with it came consequences, ripples, reactions. The first was chemical. Oxygen, now freed from its aquatic prison and drifting up into the air, didn't remain idle. It reacted with everything. It oxidized exposed minerals, it transformed metals, it triggered weathering reactions in rock that had never seen its touch. Old surface chemistries disappeared. New ones were born. The land, such as it was, began to blush with rust. But beneath the surface, the consequences were even more profound. Deep in the ocean's darkened layers, an invisible war broke out, a war of molecules and metabolism. As oxygen diffused into the upper ocean, it created sharp chemical gradients. The shallows were now slightly more breathable. The depths remained anoxic, still ruled by sulfur, methane and iron. This stratification of the ocean, oxygens above, poisons below, produced zones of intense chemical competition. Bacteria that once thrived in a world without oxygen were forced downward, squeezed into smaller and smaller niches clinging to the shadows. Some adapted, some evolved, others vanished. Their metabolic pathways, once dominant across the globe, were now becoming relics. And then came the sulfur. In this new chemical environment, certain bacteria began producing hydrogen sulfide, a gas as toxic as it is pungent. In modern terms, you'd recognise it by its rotten egg smell. But in the Proterozoic seas it was more than a smell. It was a threat. These sulfide-producing microbes thrived in anoxic waters, and as they bloomed they released vast quantities of hydrogen sulfide into the ocean, and, during certain intervals, into the atmosphere. This phenomenon is known as euxemia, a condition where water is both anoxic and rich in sulfide, and it can be devastating. Hydrogen sulfide is deadly to most forms of aerobic life. It binds to proteins. It disrupts cellular respiration. In high enough concentrations, it can suffocate even the hardiest of organisms, and worse, it can destroy ozone in the upper atmosphere, weakening the planet's shield against ultraviolet radiation. In these euxinic episodes, Earth became not only a chemically divided planet, but a toxic one. We see this legacy preserved in black shales, fine-grained sediments rich in organic matter, formed in anoxic conditions. These rocks are more than fossils. They are the breath of ancient microbes, the residue of a poisoned sea, and the poison didn't stop at the shoreline. As oxygen struggled to rise in the atmosphere, methane levels, once the planet's primary greenhouse gas, continued to fall. Methane is many times more effective than carbon dioxide at trapping heat, so when oxygen oxidized it into less potent CO2 and water, the planet's thermostat shifted dramatically. The result was cooling, and perhaps even the first of Earth's great glaciations. The Huronian glaciation, which occurred shortly after the Great Oxidation event, may have been triggered by this very feedback. As oxygen stripped methane from the air, the greenhouse weakened, temperatures plummeted, ice crept across the globe, the tropical seas where microbes once thrived turned to slush. This feedback loop is a perfect example of Earth's interconnectedness. Microbes change the air changes the climate alters habitats shift species shift chemistry, and chemistry begins the loop again. There is a haunting elegance to it, and through it all, life endured. Not everywhere, not unchanged, but it endured. Many of the anaerobic organisms, those that couldn't tolerate oxygen, were driven into isolated environments, deep sediments, hot springs, volcanic soils. They became extremophils, living relics of an earlier world. Others evolved new metabolic tools, new proteins, new enzymes to cope with oxidative stress. You can still find their descendants today, bacteria that flourish without oxygen, tucked away in deep-sea vents or underground aquifers, quietly keeping the memory of an older Earth alive. Meanwhile, the newly oxygenated world opened doors for evolutionary innovation. With oxygen came the possibility of oxidative metabolism, a far more efficient way to produce energy. This allowed cells to grow larger, to support more complexity, to build internal structures. This metabolic leap didn't happen overnight. It required a long prelude of trial and error, of mutation and selection. But it happened. And one of the outcomes was the appearance of eukaryotes, cells with nuclei, organelles, and internal compartmentalization. The earliest eukaryotes were likely small, still single-celled, and still living in microbial mats or planktonic communities. But they were different. They were modular, flexible, capable of things no prokaryote had ever dreamed. The rise of eukaryotes marks one of the great transitions in the history of life, and while oxygen wasn't the sole cause, it was certainly a catalyst. Without it, the energetic demands of complex cells would have been impossible to meet. But oxygen, as always, gave with one hand and took with the other. The surface of the planet changed, minerals oxidized, rocks weathered, rivers carried new elements into the sea, phosphorus, molybdenum, trace metals, all of which shaped microbial ecosystems. The oceans themselves changed colour and flavour. Where once they shimmered with dissolved iron, now they sparkled with new chemistry. And in the sedimentary layers we see this shift, a transition from banded iron formations to red beds, continental rock stained with oxidized iron. The very ground turned red. Not because someone painted it, but because microbes changed the sky. The rusting of the planet is one of Earth's most visible scars, a reminder that invisible life given time can reforge a world. And the atmosphere? It didn't become breathable all at once. For a long time, oxygen levels remained low, perhaps 1 or 2% of today's levels. Not enough for animals, not enough for fire, just enough to tip the scales. And so, Earth entered a strange twilight, an in-between time where oxygen was present but fickle, where complexity stirred in the margins, and where the old and the new ecosystems coexisted in fragile balance. This was not a post-apocalyptic wasteland. It was a transition zone, a laboratory. And in that lab, life began to try new things. Some microbes formed colonies, others experimented with multicellularity. Genetic complexity increased. Sexual reproduction may have emerged, a reshuffling of genes that would one day fuel evolution's wildest experiments. But these early attempts were slow. They left few fossils, and for long stretches of time, Earth seemed quiet again. Yet below the surface, the gears of change continued to turn. The carbon cycle evolved. New forms of weathering emerged. Nutrient delivery to the oceans changed. And feedback loops, always ticking, set the stage for future upheavals. The planet was no longer what it had been. It had shed an older skin and emerged blinking into something unfamiliar. The age of oxygen had begun. The age of oxygen had begun. But like any new age, it was not without conflict. Oxygen was not a passive backdrop, a quiet guest that arrived and took its seat. It was active. It was reactive. It didn't just blend into the environment, it changed it, reshaped it, reordered it at every level. The biosphere responded, slowly, strangely. Not with a roar of innovation, but with countless small experiments, some dead ends, some foundations for the future. And the Earth, for its part, responded too. Geology does not sleep through revolution. The same oxygen that permitted cellular energy to flourish also sparked transformations in stone. With oxidative weathering now active on a global scale, minerals that had previously been stable began to dissolve. Soils became more dynamic. Rivers carried new solutes into the sea, metals, phosphates, clays, redesigning the very chemical soup in which life evolved. And the iron? That ancient ocean-borne iron, once free to drift in vast quantities through the water, now found itself bound by oxygen, trapped, precipitated, removed. The great iron mines of the modern world, those that fuel steel, bridges, ships, satellites, all come from these ancient deposits, laid down during this transition. The consequences for marine ecosystems were enormous. Many of the original inhabitants of Earth's oceans were adapted to high iron, low oxygen conditions. They depended on chemistry that now vanished from their world. Some organisms migrated downward, seeking shelter in deep anoxic layers where oxygen could not reach. Others adapted, evolving ways to use new elements or to resist oxygen's toxicity. Some simply faded into extinction. But in the shallows, in those thin slivers of oxygen-rich water near the surface, new life flourished. This was the beginning of the oxygen oases, localized zones of breathable water where the old world and the new collided. Within these zones, microbial mats began to shift in composition. Cyanobacteria dominated. New microbial consortia formed. It was like a rehearsal for modern ecosystems, written in the microbial key. And still, the consequences kept layering. The shift in ocean chemistry made trace metals like molybdenum, zinc, and copper more available, elements essential to the enzymes that power complex cellular functions. With them came new metabolic potential. Life began to experiment not only with how it breathed, but with how it grew, how it divided, how it coordinated. Oxygen didn't just permit larger cells, it permitted better ones. It enabled biochemical specialization. It allowed cells to invest in complexity, not just for survival, but for interaction. And in the long run, this created space for multicellular life, not as a miracle, but as a series of accidents that worked. Yet the world was still unstable. The atmosphere oscillated between calm and chaos. Oxygen levels fluctuated, sometimes high enough to support aerobic life, sometimes crashing low again, poisoned by resurgent sulfur or methane. These were not stable centuries, they were jagged aeons. One of the culprits was Earth's sulfur cycle. As sulfate levels increased in the ocean, a consequence of oxidative weathering on land, sulfate-reducing bacteria boomed. These microbes produced hydrogen sulfide as waste, contributing to euxinic conditions, that toxic mix of anoxia and sulfide that turned large swathes of the ocean into chemical kill zones. These episodes of euxinia left behind sulfur isotope signatures in sedimentary rock, odd ratios that act like fingerprints, proving that not only was the world oxygenating, it was also responding in complex, often hostile ways. There is even some evidence that these euxinic intervals might have reached the atmosphere, releasing hydrogen sulfide into the air. At high concentrations, this gas can strip away ozone, allowing lethal UV radiation to reach the surface. For early eukaryotes, this would have been catastrophic. Perhaps one reason multicellularity remained a fringe strategy for so long. Still, life persisted. In pockets, in crevices, in environments too complex to fully kill. And even amid these crises, the seeds of cooperation were growing. Eukaryotic cells became more common. The fossil record, still sparse, begins to show signs of larger, more organized structures, perhaps colonies, perhaps tissues. It's hard to say, but the direction is clear. The Earth's climate too was caught in the feedback. The oxidation of methane, the expansion of carbon burial via organic-rich shales, the drawdown of CO2 via weathering, all of it contributed to global cooling. The Huronian glaciation may have been the first, but it was not the last. At least 3 major glacial events are recorded in the late Proterozoic, each more severe than the last. These weren't just chilly winters. These were planetary hibernations, ice at the equator, glaciers grinding mountain ranges, the tropics buried under snow, and in the quiet that followed each freeze, oxygen surged again. Because when the Earth froze, photosynthesis declined. CO2 from volcanoes accumulated unchecked. The greenhouse effect strengthened, the ice retreated. And photosynthetic life, starved and stretched thin, returned with vengeance. Each cycle was a lesson, a rehearsal, a test of biological endurance. By the end of these wild oscillations, life had changed. Cells had become more sophisticated. Genetic material was more diverse. Metabolic flexibility had increased. And most important of all, cooperation between cells, true multicellularity had arrived. Somewhere in these glacial interludes, the first complex multicellular organisms emerged. They weren't fast, They weren't armoured, they didn't hunt, but they were organised. The Ediacaran biota, appearing around 600 million years ago, marked a quiet revolution. They absorbed nutrients from the water, spread their flat bodies across seafloor mats, and left soft impressions in the sediment. Their remains were delicate, rarely fossilised, but they are real, and they are different. They speak of a new world, a world where oxygen is no longer the threat, but the medium, a world where biology no longer just survives, but builds. The chain reactions that began with the Great Oxidation Event had reshaped the oceans, the atmosphere, the rocks, and the genes. They had winnowed the possibilities of life and opened new ones. They had created space not just for survival, but for structure. And structure would soon bloom into motion, into behaviour, into ecosystems with depth. But those are stories for another night. Because here, at the close of the immediate aftermath, Earth stands changed. Not healed, not finished, but different. It is a planet with breath, with storms and silences shaped by biology, with rocks stained by the waste of cells too small to see, with skies cleared not by magic, but by chemistry, with oceans that have tasted both rust and poison and still find a way to carry life forward. The Great Oxidation Event wasn't just a turning point, it was a declaration that life doesn't just live on Earth, it writes it, one molecule at a time. The Great Oxidation Event feels like a beginning, a moment where the world turned a page and the sky itself learned to breathe. But in truth, it was only one chapter in a much longer tale. Earth, even 3 billion years ago, had already lived through cycles of creation and collapse, innovation and silence. The rise of oxygen was not the start of change. It was part of a rhythm that had been playing for eons. To understand this moment fully, we must look back further, before the atmosphere shifted, before the iron settled, before even the first cell breathed anything at all. In the beginning, Earth was not a pale blue dot. It was red-hot and restless. Formed from the dust of dead stars and the debris of the early solar system, it accreted violently, piece by piece through collisions and impacts. For millions of years it was a molten sphere wrapped in fire and darkness, its surface too unstable for continents, too hostile for oceans. And yet, even then, the stage was being set. The Earth's first atmosphere was likely composed of hydrogen and helium, gases too light to be held for long by the planet's young gravity. They slipped into space, blown away by solar wind. In their place came a second atmosphere, born from within. Volcanic eruptions spewed carbon dioxide, nitrogen, sulfur, and water vapor into the air. These weren't just emissions, they were the first hints of stability. When the Earth finally cooled enough, water vapor condensed and fell as rain. Thousands of years of storm and deluge. The first oceans filled the planet's basins, carving a surface still young and malleable. And in those oceans, under high pressure, around volcanic vents and chemical gradients, life emerged. We do not know exactly how. We may never know. But sometime between 4.0 and 3.5 billion years ago, life appeared. Simple, single-celled, chemically strange. It may have begun with RNA, with lipid membranes, with cycles of self-replicating molecules sparked by lightning or heat or minerals. However it happened, it was fast, geologically speaking, and it never left. By 3.5 billion years ago, we find signs of stromatolites, layered microbial mats that trap sediment and form rocky domes. We find isotopic signatures of carbon processed by living things. We find hints, clues, suggestions that even in Earth's most ancient days, life had already gained a foothold. This is the first pattern. Life emerges quickly when given the chance. It may take different forms. It may hug hydrothermal vents or cling to clay. But it finds a way. It is opportunistic, resourceful, and once it arrives, it begins to reshape its environment. The second pattern is this. The environment always pushes back. In the early Archean, life was limited by chemistry. There was no oxygen, only the gases that volcanism provided. Early cells adapted to anaerobic conditions. They developed metabolisms based on sulfur, iron or methane. But they were also vulnerable, dependent on delicate balances, restricted to narrow ecological niches. As photosynthesis evolved, first perhaps in purple bacteria, then later in cyanobacteria, the game changed. These organisms could use sunlight directly to split water and release oxygen. And while that oxygen was first absorbed by oceanic iron, it was destined to change the sky. This wasn't a single innovation. It was the first major disruption, the first mass extinction, the first global transformation caused by life itself. But it wasn't the last, because Earth's history is not a steady march toward complexity. It is a sequence of interruptions. The Great Oxidation Event disrupted the Archean world, but it was itself disrupted later by new glaciations, new climatic loops, new tectonic rearrangements. The boring billion that followed, so named because life seemed to slow, oxygen levels plateaued and fossils were rare, is now seen not as dull, but as stabilizing. It was the planet catching its breath, building new systems, sorting out feedbacks. It was during this time that supercontinents began to form. Rodinia, one of the earliest, gathered together massive blocks of land into a single sprawling expanse. Its formation and eventual breakup had sweeping consequences, changing ocean currents, weather patterns and nutrient flows. These tectonic movements pulsed through Earth's chemistry, impacting where oxygen was produced and how it was stored. That too is a pattern. Tectonics is the deep engine beneath life's dance. Without it, nutrients would stagnate, mountains would not rise and erode, minerals would not cycle through land and sea. Tectonics is what refreshes the planet, and every rise of a mountain range, every rift in a sea floor, leaves fingerprints in biology. Just as life shapes the atmosphere, geology shapes life. There are also echoes to consider, foreshadowings. The rise of oxygen was not the only time gases would swing and bring upheaval. Much later, during the Permian extinction, carbon dioxide would spike and wipe out 90% of species. In the Devonian, changes in ocean oxygen levels would trigger extinctions of coral and early fish. Even today, in our own Anthropocene, we see echoes of these past cycles. Feedbacks triggered, thresholds approached, climate disrupted. It's not that history repeats itself exactly, but it rhymes. Patterns of rise and fall, of balance and breach, are written into the rock. Life expands, reshapes the environment, and is pushed back. Then it adapts, recovers, and begins again. Evolution isn't a straight line. It's a spiral staircase, sometimes ascending, sometimes spinning in place, sometimes collapsing and forcing a rebuild from the rubble. The Great Oxidation Event, viewed from this wide angle, is part of that spiral. It was not unique in its disruption, but it was foundational. It set the precedent for what would come later. The idea that tiny life forms could fundamentally rewrite a planet's geochemistry is not just astonishing, it's sobering. Because we often think of life as fragile, as at the mercy of volcanoes and asteroids, and often it is. But sometimes life is the asteroid. Sometimes life brings its own extinction, not by malice or mistake, but simply by being too good at surviving, too good at changing its surroundings. Oxygen was a byproduct of survival. It was never the goal. Yet its accumulation changed the temperature, the ocean's structure, the mineral cycles, and ultimately the course of evolution. It created winners and losers. It rewrote the script. And this brings us to a deeper idea, a humbling one. What if Earth's history isn't about species at all? Not about trilobites or trees or us, but about feedback, about a planet that keeps finding balance through disruption, that lets one system grow until it threatens the whole, and then cools it, curbs it, resets the conditions. Not deliberately, not with agency, but with an uncanny ability to course correct. Oxygen rose, Life flourished, life crashed, ice spread, volcanoes warmed the planet again. Life returned, more complex than before. Cycles within cycles, nested stories. There were earlier events too, less visible but equally profound. The invention of methanogenesis, when microbes began producing methane, helped warm the early Earth. The rise of an oxygenic photosynthesis, before the oxygen-releasing kind we know today, added new dimensions to microbial energy strategies. Even the formation of Earth's core and the ignition of the magnetic field were essential, protecting the early atmosphere from being stripped away. Without those quieter innovations, the Great Oxidation could never have happened. Without the magnetic field, oxygen would have been lost to space. Without plate tectonics, nutrients would have locked away in stone. Without oceans, photosynthesis would have had no medium to flourish in. And without feedback, the chemical, geological, biological kind, none of it would have meant anything. So perhaps the deeper truth is this: Earth isn't just alive, it's reflexive. It doesn't just host ecosystems, it is an ecosystem, a planetary scale organism, not in the mystical sense, but in the system science sense, a network of parts that influence each other. Air changes water, water changes rock, rock changes life, life changes air, and the loop continues. Today, we name this idea the Gaia hypothesis, not as a deity, but as a framework for understanding Earth as a living system. The Great Oxidation event was its first real proof of concept. Life changed the planet, and the planet responded. So when we look back, past the Ediacaran, past the cryogenian glaciers, past the quiet stromatolites and the fiery Archean crust, we don't just see events. We see themes, transformation, tension, time, and through it all, the quiet persistence of life. This is the broader context, that Earth has always been in flux, that disruption is part of its function, that feedback and failure are how the planet breathes, that even extinction, as final as it seems, is often the beginning of something stranger. And as we move forward into new discoveries, new chapters, new climates, we carry that memory with us. The world we live in was not given. It was forged, again and again, in fire and ice, in oxygen and silence, in light and in chemical dark. It was made not just by cataclysms, but by cells, not just by explosions, but by the slow, stubborn work of life. And it is still becoming. Even now, we often picture the past as something sealed, fossilized in amber, buried under stone, unreachable to all but time itself. But in truth, the past is scattered everywhere. You just have to know how to listen for it. Sometimes it's a whisper in a microscope. Sometimes it's a jagged outcrop beneath the desert sun. Sometimes it's a thin line of reddish rock stretching along a cliff face, inconspicuous to most eyes but electric to the trained gaze of a geologist. And in those quiet places, those forgotten corners of Earth where nothing seems to be happening, scientists have spent generations pulling pieces of deep time from the ground. The story of how we came to understand the Great Oxidation event and the ancient world it transformed is not just a story of gases and minerals, it's a story of people, curious, persistent, sometimes stubborn, often sunburned, who went looking for something they couldn't yet name. Take, for instance, the wide expanse of Western Australia's Pilbara Craton, a region of blistering heat, scattered shrubs, and some of the oldest rocks on the planet. It was here that a quiet revolution began, not in the rocks themselves, but in how we read them. In the 1980s, a paleobiologist named J. William Schopf peered into a microscope and saw filaments, tiny, thread-like shapes in chert, fossilized silica, that looked suspiciously like microbes. They came from the Apex Chert Formation, dated to around 3.5 billion years old. At first, his announcement seemed almost too big to believe. He was claiming to have found the earliest fossils of life on Earth. And not just any life. Photosynthetic bacteria, possibly related to the cyanobacteria that would one day oxygenate the sky. The debate that followed was long, passionate, and deeply human. Some scientists agreed, others raised doubts. Were the filaments truly biological? Or could they be the result of mineral growth mimicking organic shapes? The line between life and non-life is blurry, especially when the evidence is older than most continents. Years passed, techniques improved. New studies used Raman spectroscopy and isotope analysis to investigate the apex chert. Some findings supported the biological origin. Others challenged it. Even today, the debate simmers quietly in the background, a reminder that in science, mystery often lingers longer than certainty. But even if the apex fossils remain contested, they opened a door. They showed that the search for early life was possible, that it was worth digging in the harshest, oldest, least hospitable parts of the world, and so researchers kept digging. In South Africa's Barberton-Greenstone belt, they found more clues: microbial mats, carbon isotope ratios, banded iron formations. These rocks too whispered of an ancient Earth, of oceans rich in iron and microbes already metabolizing the world. One name rises often in this search: Roger Buick. An astrobiologist and geologist, Buick's work helped redefine our understanding of early Earth environments. He studied the Asua supracrustal belt in Greenland and the Hamersley Basin in Australia, revealing chemical evidence of early photosynthesis and the first signs that oxygen had begun to leave its mark. But perhaps even more striking was the shift in how scientists began to read the rocks, not as inert, silent slabs, but as layered narratives, as books written in iron and sulfur, carbon and silicon. To read a rock, after all, is to read in the language of pressure and time. In Canada's Temagami region, deep drill cores revealed ancient sediments rich in iron, deposited in rhythmic layers, the banded iron formations. Geologists puzzled over them for decades. Why would iron fall out of seawater in such neat bands? What turned the water from clear to rust, again and again? The answer lay not in a single eureka moment, but in the slow accumulation of data. By the late 20th century, a model emerged. Early oceans had been saturated with dissolved iron. Then, as oxygen-producing microbes released their gas, that oxygen reacted with the iron, forming rust. The bands, it seemed, recorded pulses of oxygen, perhaps tied to seasonal blooms of cyanobacteria, or to long, slow changes in ocean currents and nutrient flows. This realization changed everything. The rocks weren't just showing that oxygen existed. They were showing that it changed the ocean, that it built the sediments we now use to piece the past together. It was around this time that a new generation of scientists began asking a deeper question. Not just when did oxygen appear, but how fast did it accumulate? Was the rise smooth, chaotic? Did it happen once or in waves? Enter isotope geochemistry, one of the most powerful tools in Earth history's toolbox. By measuring the ratios of different isotopes, versions of elements with different numbers of neutrons, scientists can infer past conditions. Sulfur isotopes in particular became a crucial clue. In oxygen-free environments, sulfur undergoes certain reactions that produce distinctive isotope signatures. But when oxygen levels rise, those reactions change, and sometime around 2.45 billion years ago, those sulfur signals disappeared, replaced by a new pattern consistent with a world where free oxygen was present in the atmosphere. This sulfur signal became a global marker, a chemical signature of the Great Oxidation Event. Found in rocks across continents, it was the geochemical equivalent of a turning point written into Earth's autobiography. And it brought with it new questions. How did oxygen rise in the first place? Was it just cyanobacteria? Were tectonics involved? Did the burial of organic carbon play a role by preventing oxygen from being used up? One of the most influential figures in this line of inquiry was Donald Canfield, a geochemist who proposed a new model of Earth's oxygenation history. In the 1990s, he argued that the ocean remained largely anoxic long after oxygen appeared in the air, that for over 1 billion years deep waters were dominated by sulfide and iron, not oxygen. This model, now known as the Canfield Ocean, suggested that early Earth was more chemically complex than we'd thought, that oxygenation wasn't a clean sweep but a patchwork, a slow, lurching process marked by fits, stalls, and strange intermediate states. Other researchers added their own threads to the story. Timothy Lyons explored how trace metals, like molybdenum and vanadium, responded to oxygen levels, using them as proxies for ancient redox conditions. Shuhai Xiao investigated early multicellular life and the environmental shifts that may have supported it. James Farquhar refined our understanding of sulfur isotope anomalies and what they say about early atmospheric chemistry. Together, their work formed a chorus, not in perfect harmony, but in shared pursuit. A scientific symphony unfolding across labs, deserts, glaciers, and ocean floors, and always there were the rocks, waiting, watching. Each time a new core sample was drilled, a new isotope analysed, a new microfossil imaged, it added one more note to the music of Earth's deep past. And while many of these discoveries happened in labs, some of the most moving moments occurred out in the field. Imagine a graduate student in Greenland hammering at a rock half buried in snow, unaware that the sample they collect will later reveal an isotopic signature 3.8 billion years old. Imagine a geochemist hiking through the Namibian desert, sweltering under the weight of water, notebooks, and hope. Imagine a paleontologist brushing dust from a flat stone and realizing suddenly that the pattern beneath their fingers is not random. It's cellular. These are not scenes from movies. They are real. And they happen not because of luck, but because of persistence. Science, especially the science of ancient things, is built not on genius alone, but on patience, on long days in the field, on slow scans of data, on hypotheses that die with dignity and others that refuse to go away. The story of the great oxidation event is still unfolding. New methods, like synchrotron imaging, clumped isotope analysis, and machine learning reconstructions of biochemical pathways, are adding new depth to old questions. And soon they may answer some of the biggest ones. Did oxygen rise once, or in bursts? Was it driven by biology alone, or also by plate tectonics and planetary cooling? Could it happen again, on other worlds? And what does it mean that life on Earth almost choked on its own success? These aren't just scientific questions, they're philosophical ones. They ask us to see ourselves not as masters of Earth, but as its latest experiment. They ask us to consider how fragile balance can be, and how small creatures, seen only in microscopes or rock impressions, can shake the sky. Because in the end, what the scientists discovered was not just oxygen, it was agency. The idea that life could shape planets, that microbes could trigger snowball Earths, that cells too small to see could change the colour of the ocean, the taste of the air, the course of geology itself. And that, perhaps, is the most extraordinary thing of all. We didn't just find evidence of the past, we found a mirror. To study the Great Oxidation Event or any ancient Earth mystery is to accept that you will never see the full picture. The work is about inference, not certainty. You gather fragments, you build models, you wait for the stone to speak, and yet, through all this waiting, something happens to the people who dedicate their lives to the planet's long memory. They begin to change the way they see time, not as a line, but as a landscape, not as something that passes, but as something they move through, slowly, deliberately, like archaeologists wandering through invisible architecture. This kind of thinking produces a different kind of scientist. Some become detectives, focused on the smallest clues, a spike in an isotope ratio, a chemical residue trapped in quartz. Others become poets, compelled by the elegance of cycles, the way feedback dances between gas and rock, And some, perhaps most, become pilgrims, returning again and again to the same field sites, the same cores, the same ancient formations, not because they hope to be surprised, but because they know that even after decades the Earth still holds something back. One such place, sacred to this lineage of Earth storytellers, is the Gunflint Iron Formation, along the shores of Lake Superior in Canada. Here, in fine-grained cherts over 1.9 billion years old, researchers discovered some of the most beautifully preserved microfossils ever found. Tiny thread-like organisms, some spiraled, some clustered, captured in stone with exquisite detail. Under the microscope they seem alive, as if the rock had simply paused them in motion. In the 1960s, Elso Bargorn and his student Stanley Aramic described these fossils as early evidence of complex microbial ecosystems, likely cyanobacteria. Their presence in such old rocks helped confirm the timeline of the oxygen rise, placing living photosynthetic communities well before atmospheric oxygen became abundant. But more than that, these fossils brought something emotional to the science. They made the invisible real, not just numbers or signatures, but faces, if one can call them that, etched into the ancient mirror. And as more fossils appeared, the narrative deepened. In Australia's Turi Creek Basin, scientists found layers of rock marking the transition from a low-oxygen world to one with clear atmospheric oxygen. It wasn't a single layer, but a span of rock, a passage. Researchers like Kurt Konhauser explored how microbial communities responded to this shift, proposing that iron and phosphorus cycling played a pivotal role in shaping early biospheres. The models got better. The data grew richer. But the heart of the work stayed the same, walking into the silence of ancient rock, asking questions in a language made of elements, and hoping the Earth answers with something new. There's a certain humility required for this kind of science. The scales are vast, the questions slow. You can spend 10 years studying a mineral boundary in one region, only to find a counterexample halfway across the globe. You can chase a theory through decades of papers, refining and challenging and discarding pieces of it, until only a kernel remains. Even then, it may be overturned by one better dataset, one better drill core, and yet no one seems to leave the field. They keep going back, not because they expect final answers, but because they've fallen in love with the pursuit, the act of listening, the poetry of rocks. Consider the teams that venture to the Isua Greenstone Belt in Greenland, home to rocks over 3.7 billion years old. The terrain is brutal, the weather unpredictable. Yet every summer, geologists hike for miles across glacial plains to sample these ancient stones. Some bring back small chips of banded iron. Others seek graphite grains. Carbon, maybe biological, maybe not. The samples are tiny. The journey, immense. And still they go. Because that graphite, if biological, is among the oldest evidence of life on Earth. And if it's not, if it turns out to be abiotic, then we've learnt something just as profound, that some carbon signals we thought we understood might have been misleading. And that forces us to refine the entire toolkit of deep biosignature detection. This is not failure, this is calibration, and it echoes far beyond Earth. Because as we develop tools to study our own planet's ancient transitions, we're also building the instruments that will one day search for life on Mars, on Europa, on exoplanets dozens of light years away. The techniques used to study the Great Oxidation Event, sulfur isotope fractionation, redox-sensitive metal analysis, microfossil imaging, are the same ones we'll use to ask, is life elsewhere possible? So in a way, these geologists, these paleobiologists, these isotope chemists, they aren't just telling Earth's story, they're writing the introduction to a much bigger one. But the discoveries don't only happen in the field. Some of the most striking breakthroughs have come from labs, universities and quiet offices, where datasets grow into models and computer simulations breathe motion into static assumptions. Researchers like Noah Planavsky, for instance, have helped revise our timelines of oxygenation using clever proxies. measuring elements like chromium and uranium in ancient sediments to reconstruct how oxygen moved through water and air. His work revealed that low levels of oxygen may have existed much earlier than we thought, suggesting the rise was not sudden, but prolonged and spatially patchy. Other scientists, like David Catling, have developed planetary models that simulate the balance between volcanic gas release, burial of organic matter, and the oxidation of Earth's surface. Their work ties the dots between biology and geology in dynamic, evolving loops. And still others, climate modelers, sedimentologists, planetary scientists, feed their findings into shared networks of data and understanding. Together, they build not a single story, but a fractal web of possibilities, theories that overlap and collide and converge until a clearer picture starts to take shape. And what that picture shows is this: that our breathable air, our vibrant oceans, our stable climate, these are not default settings. They are the result of a billion-year balancing act, initiated not by animals or plants, or even the Earth itself, but by microbes who had no idea what they were doing. And the humans who discovered this? They too did not begin with full understanding. They began with confusion, with false starts, with questions written in stone. They began, in other words, with curiosity, and it's curiosity, more than anything, that threads through this long chain of discovery. It's what drives a field scientist to camp beside a frozen river just to reach a particular outcrop. It's what drives a lab technician to run the same isotope test 20 times, chasing a margin of error that others would call trivial. It's what drives theorists to model oxygen concentrations on imaginary planets, just to test whether life must produce a signal like ours. Because the stakes aren't just academic, they're existential. If Earth's breathable air was made by accident, by life changing its environment beyond recognition, then what about us? What happens when life becomes geological again? When humanity, with its carbon emissions and habitat transformations and atmospheric chemistry, begins to leave fingerprints as lasting as the banded iron formations? In a strange way, the story of the Great Oxidation Event folds forward as well as back. It teaches us that feedbacks matter, that small things accumulate, that atmospheres respond, that thresholds once crossed are not always reversible. And this is why these scientists keep going, why they return to the Pilbara, the Isua, the Gunflint, the deep cores from Russia and China and Wyoming. They're not just seeking the past, they're learning how to see the present, with clarity, with humility, with awe, and with the understanding that the most powerful forces in Earth's history have never been the loudest, but the quietest. Microbes, sediments, slow breaths of gas, and now, us. To most people, a rock is a rock. But to someone fluent in the Earth chemistry, that rock is a record, a timestamp, a memory, a vault full of molecular echoes waiting to be opened. And in the study of Earth's distant past, especially events as immense and ancient as the rise of oxygen, chemistry becomes more than a discipline. It becomes a language, one spoken in ratios, in isotopes, in elements that drift and bond and settle into place like actors in a slow-moving play. This is where our journey turns technical, but not cold. Because within the depths of geochemistry lies a story just as beautiful, just as fragile and curious as the fossils it supports. And if we read it closely enough, we begin to see not just what happened, but how it happened, and sometimes why. Let's begin with sulfur. Of all the elements that tell tales of the Great Oxidation Event, sulfur is perhaps the most eloquent, not because it's abundant, it isn't, but because it changes personalities under different conditions. In the absence of oxygen, sulfur cycles through the Earth in ways that create very specific isotopic fingerprints. One of these is called mass-independent fractionation, or MIF. To explain it simply, in most chemical reactions, isotopes behave in predictable, mass-dependent ways. Heavier ones move slower, react differently. But in Earth's early atmosphere, Ultraviolet light from the sun could split sulfur molecules in odd ways that didn't follow the usual rules. These strange reactions left behind anomalous ratios of sulfur isotopes in ancient rocks. For a long time, these MIF signals were everywhere. They showed up in Archean sediments, evidence that Earth's atmosphere lacked oxygen and thus had no protective ozone layer to block UV rays. Then, around 2.45 billion years ago, they disappeared, almost overnight geologically speaking. The leading explanation: oxygen levels rose, ozone formed, UV light could no longer penetrate deeply into the atmosphere, and those strange sulfur reactions, like old dialects, faded from the chemical conversation. This disappearance of MF is one of the cleanest geochemical markers we have for the Great Oxidation Event. It doesn't just tell us that oxygen appeared, it tells us when Earth's sky itself changed. But sulfur isn't alone. Next, there's carbon. In the carbon cycle, the burial of organic carbon is key to understanding how oxygen accumulates. When photosynthetic organisms, like cyanobacteria, use sunlight to fix carbon dioxide into sugars, they release oxygen as a byproduct. But if that organic material later decays, the oxygen gets reabsorbed. It's only when dead biomass is buried, locked away in sediments, that oxygen can stay free in the atmosphere. This is what geologists call a carbon burial efficiency problem. If ancient oceans buried more carbon than they decomposed, oxygen could build up. If they didn't, oxygen stayed capped. The ratio between carbon-12 and carbon-13 in rocks helps scientists reconstruct how much organic material was buried versus how much cycled back through respiration. And in periods just after the Great Oxidation Event, we see spikes in this ratio. Signals that suggest more biomass was being buried. More oxygen could persist. The planet was tipping. But even this isn't the whole story. Because to know the age of these rocks, these shifts, these biogeochemical signatures, we need a separate toolkit entirely, and that brings us to radiometric dating. This is the method by which scientists assign ages, real, absolute numbers, to the formations we've been discussing. Not just relative orders like before or after, but timestamps: 2.45 billion years, 1.88 billion years, 720 million years. The most common technique for ancient rocks is uranium-lead dating, often performed on zircon crystals. Zircon is incredibly durable. It survives heat, pressure, erosion, and when it forms, it incorporates uranium atoms into its crystal lattice but not lead. As uranium decays slowly over time into lead, the ratio between the two gives us an atomic clock. These clocks, scattered across cratons and buried beneath mountain roots, let us anchor Earth's deep past in real chronology. Without them, the story would float. With them, it becomes fixed. We can say with real confidence when oxygen rose, when glaciation struck, when microbial fossils formed, and from there, another science steps in to add depth. Paleobiology. This is where we stop talking only about gases and start talking about life. Paleobiologists study the remnants of ancient organisms, not just their shape, but their ecology, their behaviour, their chemistry. They examine stromatolites for signs of community structure. They analyse cell wall residues for lipid biomarkers. They peer into cherts and shales to find preserved microbial textures. One tool they often use is microspectroscopy, allowing them to scan tiny fossils for molecular compounds. Certain lipids, for example, like 2-methylhopanes, are associated with cyanobacteria. If you find them in a rock, it's a good bet that photosynthesis was happening there. Another tool is scanning electron microscopy, which reveals fossil cell walls in minute detail. These microfossils can sometimes be identified down to functional groups. Was it a sulfur reducer, a photosynthesizer, an archean? And then there's isotopic fingerprinting of nitrogen, which tells us about nutrient cycling. Was nitrogen being fixed biologically? How much of it? Was it oxidized? Together, these data points allow paleobiologists to reconstruct not just when life existed, but what kind of life it was and how it interacted with its environment. And through all of this, one truth becomes clear: no signal stands alone. It's the convergence of data from sulfur, carbon, nitrogen, uranium, and the fossil record that lets scientists build a coherent picture. Like painters working from scattered brushstrokes, they blend data until a shape emerges. That shape becomes our map of early Earth. But even then, something is missing. Because understanding the past isn't just about knowing what was, it's about understanding how it behaved. What were the drivers? What were the feedbacks? This is where climate modelling enters the stage. Modern researchers build simulations of ancient Earth, inputting variables like solar intensity, greenhouse gas concentrations, albedo from ice sheets, ocean circulation patterns. These models are tested against known geological records. Do they produce snowball Earth? Do they match observed isotope curves? One famous model shows how a modest rise in oxygen could trigger methane loss, leading to rapid cooling. Another explores how continental breakup affected nutrient delivery, stimulating blooms of photosynthetic microbes and further oxygenation. These models aren't perfect, but they are improving. Especially now, with the help of machine learning, which is starting to detect patterns in complex climate systems that were previously invisible to human researchers. Together, these tools, geochemistry, radiometric dating, paleobiology, climate models, they don't give us a single answer. They give us a range of possibilities, a space of scenarios, a kind of memory cloud, hazy at the edges but increasingly sharp in the middle. And through this cloud, another question emerges, a larger one. If Earth's oxygenation was driven by life, and life altered the entire planet, could it happen somewhere else? This is where astrobiology, a science born from the ashes of astronomy, biology, and geology, steps forward. Astrobiologists take the lessons of Earth and project them outward. They ask, what would an oxygenation event look like on an exoplanet? Could we detect its chemical fingerprints with a telescope? Could we one day see another world mid-transition, its oceans rusting, its skies shifting, its life building a new atmosphere? Some of the upcoming space missions like LUVOIR and HABEX are designed to do just that, to look for oxygen, methane, and other biosignature gases in distant atmospheres, to search, not for life itself, but for the chemical echoes of life's breath. And in this way, the Great Oxidation Event becomes more than just a chapter in Earth's history. It becomes a template, a kind of cosmic pattern, a story that might be playing out right now somewhere in the quiet cold of another solar system, where a small blue-green dot is learning to breathe. The deeper we dig into Earth's past, the more we come to see it as a series of balancing acts, delicate and dynamic, measured not in hours or seasons but in millions of years. The rise of oxygen was one of those rare planetary-scale moments when the balance tipped and never quite returned. But even today, our planet is still adjusting, still echoing from that ancient event. And the systems that keep it stable, the carbon cycle, the nitrogen cycle, the water cycle, the biological pump, the feedback loops that tie mountain weathering to ocean alkalinity, these are not static structures. They are living patterns, constantly in motion, responsive to the smallest nudge or largest surge. Understanding them requires tools both precise and philosophical. Take the silicate weathering feedback, for example, a mechanism by which carbon dioxide is drawn out of the atmosphere over long timescales. When rain falls on silicate rocks, it slowly dissolves them, forming bicarbonate ions that wash into the oceans, where they help build carbonate minerals, locking carbon away. This process is temperature sensitive. The warmer the planet, the faster the reaction. In this way, Earth cools itself over geologic time. Scientists have modelled how this system may have helped modulate Earth's temperature during the Great Oxidation Event. As methane declined and CO2 became the dominant greenhouse gas, silicate weathering may have gradually lowered carbon levels, contributing to a cooling trend that fed into the Huronian glaciation. But the reverse is also true. When continental weathering slows, perhaps due to glaciation or tectonic quiescence, CO2 can rise again, warming the planet and ending the Ice Age. This back-and-forth pattern becomes a kind of planetary breath, shallow and slow, but vital. Another system is the biological pump, the way in which life in the oceans sequesters carbon. Phytoplankton in the surface waters photosynthesize, absorbing CO2. When they die, some fraction of their biomass sinks to the ocean floor. If it escapes decomposition, it locks carbon in sediments for millions of years. This process, refined over the Proterozoic and accelerated by the rise of eukaryotes and multicellular life, became one of Earth's most powerful climate regulators. Paleoclimate models suggest that variations in the strength of the biological pump can produce major shifts in atmospheric CO2 levels, even without changes in volcanism or weathering. It's biology, not geology, that often tips the scales. And then there's ocean redox stratification, a term that might sound abstract but describes something critical to the Great Oxidation aftermath. For over 1 billion years, Earth's oceans were not fully oxygenated. The surface layers had oxygen thanks to photosynthesis, but the deep waters remained anoxic, sometimes rich in hydrogen sulfide or ferrous iron. These redox gradients shaped evolution, determining which metabolisms could thrive, which nutrients were available, and which toxins accumulated. Geochemists have traced this stratification using trace metals like molybdenum, vanadium, and chromium. These elements behave differently depending on the oxidation state of the ocean. By analysing their concentrations in sedimentary rocks, scientists can reconstruct a layered, chemically diverse ocean, one that was far from uniform and far from stable. And this brings us to one of the most nuanced fields of all, Earth system modelling. This is where all the pieces, geology, chemistry, biology, climate, tectonics, are brought into dialogue. Researchers use coupled models to simulate how a change in one component affects the others. What happens if cyanobacteria bloom in a stagnant basin? How does increased phosphorus from weathering affect primary productivity? Can oxygen accumulate if iron is still abundant? These questions aren't just academic. They define how we understand resilience and collapse. For example, models show that early oxygenation may have occurred in pulses, brief surges of O2 followed by crashes, perhaps tied to nutrient fluxes, tectonic uplift, or changes in deep ocean circulation. These false dawns may have occurred multiple times before the atmosphere finally crossed a threshold it couldn't return from, and that concept, thresholds, is central. The idea that Earth can remain in one state for millions of years, seemingly stable, and then with one tipping event reorganize itself completely. It's not chaos. It's a different kind of order, one defined by emergent behaviour, where small changes lead to large effects. Today we call these moments Earth system transitions, and the rise of oxygen was one of the first. Another may have been the cryogenian snowball Earth episodes, where runaway ice albedo feedbacks nearly froze the planet solid. Another, the Cambrian explosion, when ecological complexity skyrocketed and food webs blossomed in new directions. And perhaps now, in our own era, we stand near the edge of another one, defined not by microbes, but by us. This looping back from ancient chemistry to modern crisis is one of the more sobering aspects of deep science. Because as we study Earth's history, we begin to realise that nothing is given. Not the atmosphere, not the ocean, not even the rhythm of the seasons. All of it has changed before, and all of it can change again. This knowledge has transformed the way Earth scientists think. No longer confined to siloed disciplines, many now work across boundaries: geobiologists, climate modelers, geochemists, data scientists, building integrated views of planetary function. And with this integration has come a shift in perspective. The idea of the anthroposphere, the layer of Earth now dominated by human activity, is not just a philosophical statement, it's a geochemical one. Human emissions of carbon, our rearrangement of nitrogen, our disruption of the phosphorus cycle, these are real, measurable changes in Earth system dynamics. We are no longer observers, we are participants. And so, in a strange looping symmetry, we find ourselves echoing the cyanobacteria of old, unintentionally altering the sky, testing the balance, triggering new feedbacks we barely understand. But unlike those microbes, we have something they did not. We have hindsight. We have data, models, simulations, cores, fossils. We have stories carved in stone and coded in isotopes. We have the ability to see not just where we are, but where we might go. And perhaps, in time, we'll come to see that the lessons of the Great Oxidation Event are not just about oxygen. They're about transformation. They're about complexity emerging from simplicity. They're about the unexpected power of the small. And perhaps most of all, they're about attention, the kind that listens to whispers in rocks, that builds models from fragments, that recognizes when the atmosphere begins to turn. In that way, Earth sciences are not just a study of the past, they're a kind of listening, a way of being in relationship with the planet, not as its master, but as its student. And if we are quiet enough, humble enough, persistent enough, we may hear what it's been trying to say all along, that life is a force, that change is inevitable, that balance is temporary, and that, even across billions of years, even across mass extinctions and glacial tombs and volcanic firestorms, this planet remembers and it responds, always. When the Earth changed, it didn't announce itself with fanfare. There was no sudden dawn, no headline moment, no singular day when the sky turned blue and the air became breathable. The rise of oxygen was slow, irregular, haunted by reversals, and its aftermath was even slower. What followed wasn't a revolution, it was a recovery, and it took hundreds of millions of years. At first, the consequences of the Great Oxidation Event were brutally quiet. Many life forms that had thrived in the absence of oxygen, anaerobic bacteria, archaea, and entire microbial guilds, began to shrink into increasingly marginal niches. They didn't disappear entirely, but the central oceanic stage no longer belonged to them. They retreated underground into anoxic sediments, into sulphurous vents and deep saline basins where oxygen could not reach. There they remain today, ancient, silent, holding tight to an older script of metabolism. But above them, near the surface, something else was stirring. In the wake of oxygen's arrival, the oceans transformed. Iron, once plentiful and mobile, began to vanish, reacting with oxygen to form rust and sinking to the seafloor in massive bands. Sulfides were oxidized, methane was depleted, and with them went many of the chemical gradients that had once powered early metabolisms. Yet from this chemical clearing came possibility. The presence of free oxygen, at even trace levels, opened a biochemical frontier. It allowed for the emergence of aerobic respiration, an energy-generating process nearly 20 times more efficient than its anaerobic counterparts. Suddenly, cells could extract far more energy from the same amount of food. They could grow larger, store more information, develop internal complexity. This set the stage for the rise of eukaryotes, cells with internal compartments, nuclei, organelles. The earliest hints of them appear in the fossil record not long after the Great Oxidation Event, though likely they evolved earlier, hidden in the chemical dark. These cells were pioneers of possibility. They could ingest other cells, store excess nutrients, coordinate internal processes. And one of their greatest innovations came from a singular act of microbial intimacy, endosymbiosis. Somewhere in deep time, an ancestral eukaryote engulfed a bacterium capable of oxidative metabolism. Instead of digesting it, the host cell kept it, tamed it. That bacterium became the mitochondrion, the powerhouse of modern cells, and with it, energy scaled. This partnership allowed for a new kind of life, one that could afford to be complex, one that didn't just survive but invested in the future, in regulation, in repair, in shape. And so began a slow blossoming. The ocean, meanwhile, was catching up. Even after oxygen rose in the atmosphere, it took over 1 billion years for deep waters to oxygenate fully. In many basins, anoxic and euxinic conditions persisted. These were oceans of layered chemistry, oxygen at the top, hydrogen sulfide at the bottom, and a shifting middle ground where strange metabolism still reigned. Yet the surface was changing. The Proterozoic eon, often called Earth's boring billion, was anything but. It was a period of refinement, of slow, steady innovation. Multicellularity emerged, not as an explosion, but as an experiment repeated in many lineages. Some formed colonies, others true tissues. Cooperation became a strategy, differentiation, a theme. Simple animals, soft-bodied, often sessile, began to appear in the late Proterozoic. Their fossils are rare, delicate, but they speak of a biosphere preparing for expansion. Oxygen levels, while still modest, had become stable enough to support organisms with higher energy demands. And then, the Earth blinked. Around 720 million years ago, the planet slipped into a deep freeze, the Cryogenian period. At least 2 major global glaciations occurred, events so extreme they are known as snowball Earth episodes. Ice extended to the equator. Sunlight reflected back into space. Whole oceans may have frozen over, leaving only narrow bands of liquid water near hydrothermal vents or under thin equatorial ice. Life was tested, but it didn't die. Instead, it adapted, retreated into refugia, evolved resistance, and perhaps even took advantage of the challenges. These glaciations may have acted as evolutionary bottlenecks, pruning the tree of life while selecting for resilience and versatility. And when the ice finally receded, likely due to volcanic outgassing of CO2 building up over millions of years, the Earth warmed dramatically. Oxygen rebounded, nutrients surged into the oceans from weathered glaciers, and life responded with vigour. What followed was the Ediacaran period, and with it, the emergence of the first large complex organisms. Some resembled fronds, others were quilted ovals pressed into the seafloor. Some moved, perhaps slowly, tracking microbial mats. Others remained still. These Ediacaran biota were not yet animals as we know them, but they were something new, multicellular, organised, ecological. They formed communities. They left tracks. They grazed. And perhaps most strikingly, they laid the foundation for what came next. The Cambrian explosion. Around 541 million years ago, in a geological blink, the fossil record bloomed. Hard shells appeared, eyes, legs, jaws, predators and prey, burrows and reefs. The seafloor, once a quiet microbial mat, became an arena of motion, interaction and innovation. This explosion was fueled in part by oxygen. By this point, the atmosphere and shallow oceans had reached near-modern levels of O2. Respiration scaled, nervous systems became viable, mobility flourished, and ecological arms races began, driving evolution faster, deeper, wider. All of this, animals, ecosystems, extinction events, forests, dinosaurs, mammals, humans, was made possible by the long, slow rise of oxygen. It wasn't just a background condition, it was a creative force, and it didn't stop there. As life grew more complex, it began to shape the oxygen cycle in return. Forests increased carbon burial, drawing down CO2 and allowing oxygen to rise. Animals changed nutrient cycles through feeding and burrowing. Fungi decomposed plant matter, recycling carbon and nitrogen. The biosphere became an engine, not just of survival, but of feedback. Over the past 500 million years, oxygen levels have fluctuated. During the Carboniferous, they may have reached 35%, supporting giant insects and widespread wildfires. During the Permian, they dropped again, contributing to mass extinction. Each rise and fall was tied to life and to the geological rhythms beneath it. And through it all, oxygen remained both gift and threat. Too little, and complexity stalls. Too much, and flames spread unchecked. Life on Earth has walked that razor's edge for 500 million years, balancing between energy and safety, between breathing and burning. Today, we live in the sweet spot. Roughly 21% oxygen, stable enough to support intelligence, culture, cities. But that balance is not guaranteed, and here, in the present, we begin to reflect not just on what oxygen enabled, but on what it demands. Because for all its power, oxygen is not a promise. It is a process, ongoing, fragile, earned again and again by photosynthesis and burial, by weathering and feedback, by cycles that stretch beyond any single lifetime. The air we breathe is not a given. It is a gift handed down from microbes we cannot see, maintained by trees we take for granted, balanced by processes so slow we barely notice, until they shift, and they can shift. The slow recovery after the Great Oxidation Event reminds us, Earth does not rush. It doesn't rebuild overnight. When systems collapse, they return, if they return at all, through experimentation, patience, and time. We are part of that story now. Our species, our machines, our emissions. We are rewriting the carbon cycle. We are warming the oceans, melting the ice, releasing methane, acidifying the seas. We are once again testing the stability of the sky. And the Earth, as always, will respond, not to punish, not with malice, but simply as it has always done, with feedback, with consequence, with change. What comes next is not written, but we do know how long recovery can take. We know what happens when oxygen disappears. We know what the oceans become when balance is lost. We know the cost of forgetting what the planet is capable of. And we know, because of those slow, patient chapters written in stone, just how miraculous it is to be alive at all. To live in an atmosphere made not just of gases, but of time. To walk on a planet that once had no sky, no breath, no voice. And now, because of ancient cells, ancient choices, ancient accidents, we can speak and we can choose. Whether to become another footnote in Earth's long litany of collapses, or to become at last a species that listens. What happened 3 billion years ago may seem impossibly distant. Folded away in a realm of time so foreign it hardly feels like our world at all. A planet without animals, without flowers, without sound. No feet had ever walked the land. No eyes had yet opened to a sky. And yet, what unfolded in that ancient silence still echoes within our lungs, our thoughts, our breath. Because we are the descendants of oxygen. We live because that strange reactive gas, once toxic to life, became the medium through which complex organisms could awaken. Our energy, our movement, our entire civilization rests on a chemical coincidence so profound that it borders on myth. But it is not a myth. It is a memory, and it is written in every breath we take. When we reflect on the Great Oxidation Event, we're not just talking about geochemistry. We're not just studying the ratios of sulfur isotopes, or the pattern of rusted seafloors. We're asking something larger, more unsettling and more beautiful. What kind of planet is this, that life could change its very atmosphere? And what kind of species are we, to be doing it again? The parallel is haunting. Once, microbes released a waste product, oxygen that reshaped the Earth. It caused extinctions, it triggered glaciers, it rewrote the chemistry of oceans and skies. And now, billions of years later, we are doing something strangely similar. Only this time the waste product is carbon. The mechanisms differ, but the result is the same, a shift in the atmospheric balance, a push on the planet's thermostat, a rewriting of the rules. Just as oxygen disrupted ancient metabolisms, carbon dioxide and methane now disrupt ours, heating the oceans, acidifying the seas, thawing ancient ice. The difference is one of speed, The oxygenation of the planet took millions of years. The rise of CO2 is happening in centuries, faster than any natural climate swing we've yet detected. Faster than coral can adapt, faster than glaciers can reform, faster than ecosystems can migrate. The rate is staggering, and the consequences still unravelling. And yet, knowing this doesn't bring despair. It brings clarity. Because if a single type of microbe, simple, ancient, could shape the sky, then what might we shape with our telescopes and satellites, our ethics and art? If bacteria can initiate a planetary transformation without even knowing what a planet is, what can we do now that we do? It's a sobering kind of hope, not naive, not easy, but honest. Because Earth doesn't need us to survive. It has outlived continents. It has rebuilt oceans. It has watched the stars shift and the atmosphere turn over. The Earth will be here, volatile, breathing, adapting, long after we are gone. But life as we know it, civilization, culture, that's another matter. The lesson from 3 billion years ago is not just that oxygen changed the world, it's that it did so slowly, unevenly, unpredictably. The planet wobbled, it froze, it struggled to reach equilibrium, entire ecosystems vanished, and still, recovery took eons. This should give us pause. Because what we break today may take far longer to mend, and what we imagine as reversible, warming, acidification, extinction, may not behave the way we expect. The Earth is not a machine. It is a system, a living one, and it responds in rhythms far larger than policy cycles or economic quarters. Once a threshold is crossed, once a glacier is lost or a current slows or a species disappears, recovery is not guaranteed. The loops do not always return to where they began. And so, we are left with a kind of responsibility, not to save the Earth, but to respect it, to understand that the atmosphere we live within is the product of processes older than any story we've ever told, that the balance we enjoy is precious, contingent, and hard-won, that life itself is not permanent, but dynamic. The parallels don't end with climate, they stretch further into questions of technology, of scale, of how we measure progress. When we see the rise of oxygen as the result of countless small actions, microbes metabolizing day after day, altering the chemistry just enough to tip a world, it reminds us that transformation doesn't require intention. It only requires accumulation. This is how great changes happen. Slowly, invisibly, then all at once. We are now that force, not by malice, but by scale. Not by desire, but by momentum. We have become a geological agent, not just an observer of deep time, but a participant within it. Our cities leave stratigraphic markers, our plastics enter the fossil record, our emissions alter the isotopic ratios of carbon in the air and in the bones of fish. The Anthropocene is not a future, it is now. And yet, knowing this, we can choose how to respond. We can lean into humility, into imagination, into a kind of stewardship that sees beyond human lifetimes. Because Earth has taught us something extraordinary, that fragility and resilience are not opposites, they are companions. The biosphere is delicate, yes, but it is also astonishingly patient. Life recovers, it adapts, it experiments. Even after the oxygen rise, when Earth entered deep freezes, when whole classes of metabolism were lost, something remained. And from that something, new stories emerged. Eukaryotes, multicells, animals, thought. Life is not easily extinguished, but it is often redefined. And perhaps this is the most profound reflection of all, that life is not a ladder or a pyramid, but a river, branching, splitting, looping back, always moving. And we, brief and bright, are part of that flow. We're not its culmination, we're its moment. And in that moment we can shape what comes next. We can look to the past not as a place of loss, but of insight. The Great Oxidation event was not a tragedy, it was an opening. It was violent, yes, but it made room for something new, for energy, for movement, for vision, for future. The challenge is to take that long view and hold it in the present, to recognize that we live in a state of temporary balance, that our oceans, our atmosphere, our biosphere, none of them are static. They are responsive, they are breathing, and so are we. There is something sacred in that recognition, something beyond data, beyond politics, a kind of planetary grace, not one we earn, but one we inherit and must decide what to do with. We might choose to live differently, to listen more, to build slowly, to learn from the feedbacks and warnings of the past, to leave behind an atmosphere not broken, but better understood. Because the atmosphere is not just a sky, it is a story. It is a story that began long before us, with tiny cells and silent oceans, a story of patience, of tension, of experimentation, and it continues now, through us. The oxygen that made us is the same oxygen that once almost unmade the world, and so we hold two truths at once. We are fragile, and we are powerful. We are temporary, and we are transformative. We are a product of chance, and we are makers of consequence. The breath in your chest is older than words. It is older than fire. It is a gift passed down through 1 billion years of accident and adaptation. It is starlight, cycled through water and cell, refined by life into something that moves, speaks, remembers. What we do with it, that's the question. Will we use it to burn, or to build, to close loops, or to open futures, to silence the planet, or to listen? The Great Oxidation Event reminds us that life changes the world, that nothing on Earth is fixed, not the air, not the sea, not the land, and not us. So if you're still awake, here, at the quiet edge of deep time, just breathe. Breathe and remember, this is not just air, it is history, it is hope, it is the sound of a planet learning to speak, and it's waiting to see what you'll say next. And now, here we are again. The end of the story, but not the end of the night. We've drifted together from the furnace of the early Earth through 1 billion years of transformation. From breathless oceans to microbial whispers. From chemical chants to complexity. From an atmosphere forged in silence to one that now carries the weight of words. And through it all, one current has remained steady. The quiet wonder that comes from looking backward. Not to escape, but to understand. Because the deeper we go into Earth's past, the clearer the present becomes. Maybe tonight you'll fall asleep thinking about ancient bacteria painting the oceans red with rust. Or about a world sealed in ice, glowing faintly under a dim sun. Or about how, long before any human eye had opened, something in this world was already preparing a sky for breath. And maybe, tomorrow, you'll breathe a little more slowly. Not because you have to, but because you can. If you found this journey soothing or stirring, or just strange enough to stay with you through the dark, consider liking this video. Subscribing helps others find it too, and if there's a story of the Earth you'd like to hear whispered into the night, let us know in the comments. Here on Just About Earth, we believe that bedtime can be for learning. That awe doesn't have to be loud. That science is a lullaby, written in deep time. So rest well, wherever you are. And until next time, good night from a planet still learning how to breathe.